Welcome to Moravian Mornings, the podcast where we explore the lives, history, and culture of the Moravian settlers in Wachovia, North Carolina, and the greater Moravian world. I'm your host, Savannah Franz. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today for Historic Bethabara Park's America 250 event. We are honored to bring together this panel of outstanding scholars to help us paint a richer, more diverse landscape of peoples and experiences here in the Carolina backcountry during the American Revolution. During this live recording of our Moravian Mornings podcast, I will start us off with a few questions of my own for the panel. And if there's time at the end, we will open it up to audience questions. But it's all dependent because there is that peace walk at about 3:30 that I recommend that y'all go to. Now, we truly hope that you walk away from the park today with even more curious to explore the history of this land and all of the people that inhabited it. By learning more about our own past, we can better understand ourselves, and with luck, we can be active participants in shaping a more informed future. Now, we only have an hour to dig into our very broad topic today, so let's get started. My name is Savannah Franz, and I will be the host of this panel today. So now let us introduce our panelists. We have over here William Caldwell, Dr. Daniel Thorp, we have Dr. Kathleen DuVal, and Michelle Hopkins-Lawrence. But we'll start with them briefly introducing themselves, and why don't we start with Will?
Sure. So I'm a historian specialist in the American Revolution in early America, especially in the southern colonies and southern states, focusing on the western halves of those states. And I've worked in various agencies and organizations doing this history through speaking, writing, print, filming for about 20 years.
I'm an associate professor of history up at Virginia Tech, specializing in 18th and 19th century American history, and in previous lifetime and early in my career, I spent about 10 years studying Bethabara and the early Moravian settlement in North Carolina.
I'm Kathleen DuVal. I'm a history professor at UNC Chapel Hill, and I work on early America and the American Revolution.
I'm Michelle Hopkins-Lawrence. I am a history teacher at Salem Academy, and I also work in history for the Academy and College. And as that, I've been studying the lesser-known groups of the history of this area. So I do women in Wachovia and the Cherokees in Wachovia, as well as African Americans and their experiences in this community.
All right, ready to get started? Yes. All right, so first, I am going to take it over to you, Daniel. So, can you outline the Moravians' experience before the American Revolution with governments they lived under and with their neighbors in America and Europe that may have influenced their unique position during the War for Independence?
Yeah. The Moravians would have been very upset and concerned by the start of the revolution. They had the ancient unity from which the modern Moravian Church is descended had itself nearly been wiped out by the Catholic Church. And then the renewed Unitas Fratrum, the renewed unity, which Zinzendorf had established, they had been harassed in Europe, in Britain. They were outlawed in New York. They were imprisoned in Russia. They had recently been expelled from 2 large settlements in Germany. And the reason they came to North Carolina was to get away from other people. Spangenberg wrote, they came to a place where they could live without interfering with others and without being disturbed by them. And their success here depended on a non-democratic system of government. They thought democracy was more risky than autocracy. And that was because they could work with the governor of North Carolina. The Brethren had received special recognition by Parliament. In 1749, Parliament had granted them ancient episcopal status, which meant they were allowed to affirm rather than take oaths, and they were allowed to avoid military service. That they wanted to preserve. And they worried in North Carolina if the Crown government was overthrown in North Carolina, what would happen to their special status? They had, in the 20 years between their arrival and the outbreak of the Revolution, they had very good relations with the governor of North Carolina. And a governor in colonial North Carolina had an absolute veto over anything the assembly did. And so even though the Brethren had no voice in the assembly, they were protected by the governor. And the Revolution threatened all of that. If they backed the wrong side, they were in trouble. If the Americans won, they might well lose the privileges they had under the British government. And so the outbreak of the Revolution would have been very, very disturbing to the Brethren.
Excellent. So now to take it over to Michelle to kind of narrow in even more on the Moravians that were here. To understand a more complete picture of the people here in Wachovia, we need to understand the role of slavery in the economy and the culture of the settlement. Would you outline for us how the institution of slavery functioned in Wachovia under the Moravian Church?
Yes. So the Moravians want to be self-sufficient, and they came here with a planned community, starting with the farms at Bethabara and Bethania before building the town of Salem, which was going to be the economic center of the Wachovia tract. And because they want to be self-sufficient, they didn't have any plans to have use enslaved labor that they would purchase themselves. They weren't here to set up what we think of as plantation labor. However, they also needed men to help them build the community in its early years, and there weren't enough Moravians here to do that. So even before all the single sisters arrived to complete the community, they started to rent enslaved labor from neighbors in North Carolina as well as in Virginia. And these enslaved people who were rented, some of them would ask to become members of the community. And if the Moravians saw that the people that they were making a good faith, sincere desire to become Moravians and live according to the Moravian way of life, then the church decided that they needed to buy whoever wanted to become a Moravian. So if you were enslaved and you were rented, you couldn't be controlled by the Moravians, you couldn't be protected by the Moravians. But if they bought you, they could have you educated, you could live here, you could join the church through baptism and communion. And so this is what several members of the community did early on. People who were rented actually requested to be bought. And you should understand that for slavery with the Moravians in the beginning, it wasn't individual ownership, it was actually the community, the church as a whole, because the church owned the land. And so it was church/community that owned people. And one of the first people to be bought was Johann Samuel, and in 1765, he was first rented, and by 69, he had said he wanted to join the community, and he lived here in Bethabara, and so he was actually purchased. And by 71, he was baptized in this community, and he was baptized in 1771 at the consecration of the new Gemeinhaus, which today we would call it the Salem Home Church Congregation. But at its consecration, he was the first baptism in the town of Salem.
Excellent, thank you. So we're going to keep on zooming out now to the rest of the backcountry. So Will, walk us through an overview of the political and cultural landscape of the North Carolina backcountry outside of Wachovia. What tensions were brewing that set the scene for the Southern experience of the American War for Independence?
Wow.
Big question.
I know we only have an hour for this whole thing. So something to keep in mind when you zoom out from Wachovia and you're looking at where we are in North Carolina, this was a land of opportunity for many people that are hungry for it. So you are seeing a river of immigration coming from not only Virginia, Pennsylvania, but from Ireland, Scotland, Germany, France. As long as these people are willing to be British subjects and do whatever is required to clear the land, you have Southern governors offering huge tracts of land for either low to no rent for several years. And this is creating a huge river of people coming down the Great Wagon Road into this area through Salisbury, becoming neighbors of the Moravians. So when they sought to be here and isolate themselves, this was, I'm sure, a very rude awakening. But then when you see all these different people coming down, you have all these different communities, you have these different ideas, different religions. With the Great Awakening happening, you also start to see other religions start to rise, the split of the Presbyterian Church, Methodists, Baptists, Anglicans. So you have these groups that, while they are seeking the same thing and they are nominally on the same side, there are divisions, there are, you could say, fractures between these different communities. So when you have the stress of conflict applied to this network, some of those fractures will break open into hostility. So you see that start to happen with the Anglo-Cherokee War in 59 to 61. You have the regulator movement in 65 to 71. So by the time the revolution begins, many of these people have kind of already drawn lines, and they're already kind of suspiciously eyeing some of their neighbors for roles they had taken in some of these previous conflicts. So it's a hornet's nest, would be a summary of it.
So in the popular imagination, we've all presumably been through public schooling or schooling here, and when we learn about the American Revolution or this time period in general, it tends to be from very specific perspectives, either the great men of history or perhaps a more like military perspective. But Kathleen, I'm going to send this one to you. What groups tend to be overlooked in traditional narratives of the American Revolution in the American South specifically? And what was their situation like at the time of the Revolution?
Yeah, so I think you're exactly right. Like, the things that this panel has been talking about is so in contrast with sort of the main characters of the American Revolution. The main characters of the American Revolution, for good reason, are the men who sort of started and led the American Revolution, right? So if you think about just in the South, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they are people who supported the revolution from the beginning, or at least the protest movement that grows into rebellion and revolution, and they are coastal, right? They all are from the Tidewater or the coast of North Carolina, the coast of the Carolinas, or pretty close to it. And so there's a whole world back here beyond that, as we've just been hearing about, of people from other parts of Europe, people whose ancestors came from other parts of Europe, as Will and Daniel were talking about. There are free and enslaved people all over, in all of the colonies, free and enslaved people of African descent in all of the colonies, as Michelle was alluding to. There are also Native people who become involved in the American Revolution, and if we're sort of thinking of kind of landscape and where people are, I think one important way of understanding Native Americans and the American Revolution is that there are Native people who live within and very close to colonial communities, the ancestors of the Lumbees and the Occaneechees, and they tended at the Revolution to be on the side of the revolutionaries, and there are many ancestors of people in those tribes today who fought for the Continental Army, fought for Southern militias, rebel militias, right? But then on the other hand, there are the Cherokees in the West, and they, at the time of the American Revolution, are still an intact, independent Native nation, and those Native nations all along the border of the British colonies, they're starting to worry about encroachment by British colonists on their lands, and so they're going to tend, in contrast to the other Native Americans I'm talking about, they're going to tend to be on the side of the British if they come into the fight. Now, that's sort of a kind of a layout, maybe.
Excellent. So, sending it back to you now, Michelle. While records are non-existent on knowing the exact thoughts of enslaved people, specifically in Wachovia during this time period, what can you tell us about the experiences of the enslaved people here during the war that we do know about?
So some of the things that we know, for one, is that enslaved people in this area had, if they were members of the church, if they had joined the church, they had privileges that other enslaved people in the South would not have had. They could worshiped together. It was integrated church services. Black and white members, regardless of their social status, their legal status, they sat next to each other. They exchanged the kiss of peace. Enslaved people could be educated here. Their children could be educated here. They were married within the church, so their marriage had no legal validity outside of the Moravian community, but they had the same marriage protections, the same marriage right. They were addressed as sister and brother, which were the polite terms of address used for enslaved people. They had family names. They had last names, not just first names. They were in many ways, they were certainly treated as spiritual equals. They were buried in the same God's Acre. God's Acre here in Bethabara has members of the Samuel family. Enslaved people and free Black people are famously buried in the original God's Acre in Salem, where we have our Easter service every year. But they were legally still not free. And if they were cast out of the Moravian community, they would lose any special privileges or status they had. So as long as they were members in good standing, they could keep their families together, they could be married, they had the protection of the church. And I've often wondered, because we don't have direct records of them, we don't have their diaries, we do have some of their funeral Lebenslauf, if you know what that is, from the Moravian community. So we have what was read at their funeral, so we do know some personal details about them, but we don't have their direct words. And one of the things that I've been wondering with regard to the American Revolution is we know that the British Army offered enslaved people freedom if they would fight on the side of the British. And I wonder what some of the enslaved men of this community who were Moravians and had that protection, I wonder if they were ever tempted to take that offer. Because in 1881, we know, for example, the Samuel family is the family that I focus on. Johann Samuel didn't yet have a child in early 1881, but I think that probably by the time at the end of 1881, in December, when his daughter was born, I would think that he might prefer to stay here. I mean, it's purely speculation on my part, but he and his family were protected here as long as they stayed members of the church. And it would have been a huge risk to try and join the British Army for that chance at freedom. And in the end, the Samuel family, they were all freed because in later, long after the war, the entire family was freed. So he probably made a good calculation if he did make that choice.
Excellent. To you now, Will. What did this region and Wachovia represent to the different armies during the Revolution?
Well, so because of the opportunity, the land that was available to the immigration coming here, this became a very populated region. In fact, the population growth in the backcountry during the time just before and during the American Revolution is one of the reasons why in the early republic you start to see these states move their capitals away from the coast and start to move more inland to allow more representation and political agency for these growing backcountry communities. So when you're looking at the beginning of the revolution, you are trying to persuade people, trying to get your supporters, hearts and minds. So if you have people living there, that's where you're going to want to have a very heavy influence. So this whole region, it becomes very, very divided over loyalism or Whiggism. You start to see, famously, some of the Moravian neighbors, the Bryant family, are going to be very noted loyalist officers. But then when you're looking at for the American war effort, not only is this a place where they can get soldiers and get support, but they're aware of Wachovia. They're aware of the Moravians, the industry, the economy of these towns. So famously, during the Kings Mountain campaign of 1780, you have a bunch of militia who on their own accord, their own leaders, have gone and won a great victory over local loyalists at the Battle of Kings Mountain. And they're thinking, well, where do we go now? Where can we go where there are friends, where there is safety and distance from the remaining British Army? Where's their food? Wachovia. So they march here, and they bring their prisoners with him and camp here for 19 days, just taking and seizing, looting as much as they can while trying to keep the peace. for some of them. There's a great note in the Moravian records that when Colonel Martin Armstrong, who's kind of like the champion for protecting the Moravians, when he arrives in camp finally, there's much relief because that meant the other guys, like Ben Cleveland, are going to leave now, and his Wilkes County Devils. So it's the same offer, the same opportunity that you see by the British. When later on during 1781 and you have the American Army, the Continentals under Nathaniel Greene are going to retreat from the South Carolina border. They're going to flee towards Virginia, and you have Lord Cornwallis and the British in pursuit. They're also going to see people, food, supplies, rest, and they're going to come through Wachovia. They're going to come through Bethabara, and they're going to take all of those things, at least as much as they can. But thankfully, the British Army, being more organized, is going to be a much more peaceful event than the ragtag militia that were here previously. So this area meant a lot. And some could say that the failure of the British Army to find enough loyalist men, they kind of hinged their entire southern plan here in the Carolinas about having these local supporters to step up, serve their army, act as kind of peacekeeping security forces to hold captured areas. When they did not find that here in this part of North Carolina, these men who had fled earlier or been defeated elsewhere by 1781, they're not here. So without them, it's going to derail the entire British plan for the Carolinas.
Thank you. So Daniel, to you. What's unique about this space for the Moravians, Wachovia, is that at the time Salem, but also previously Bethabara, it was a center of trade, and they had a very unique economic position throughout their time here. So can you explain to us how did Wachovia's role as a trade center perhaps shape this Moravian community's response to the events of the war?
Yeah, it forced them to make very awkward decisions at times. As Will has mentioned, this area filled rapidly with settlers, most of whom were on isolated family farms. Wachovia, first Bethabara and then Salem, from the beginning was the trade entrepot for this entire region of the backcountry. People traveled 50, 60, 100 miles to come to Wachovia for pottery, for example, or to visit a gunsmith or whatever. For the same reason the armies came here, as Will mentioned, from the very beginning of the war. From the very beginning of the war, local militias and then later Continental Army and British troops would arrive and impress large quantities of clothing, of food, of whatever they could find. That forced the brethren to modify their behavior in certain ways. They were not pacifists, but they did object to what they considered offensive warfare. They believed in self-defense. They built the palisade during the French and Indian War, and during the Revolution, they continued to hold weapons. But they decided early on that it was difficult to explain to outsiders that they weren't pacifists, but they didn't want to use their guns offensively, so it was better just to hide all their guns. And so early in the conflict, the elders in the congregation said, let's hide our guns. Anyone who has a gun in their house, just put it away. The whole issue of pacifism was a consistent problem because, again, early in the war, the colony of North Carolina expected all adult men to serve in the militia, and the brethren resisted that. It took several years, but they eventually got a modification of the law in North Carolina that they would not be required to serve in the militia, nor would they be fined. The normal law was, if you don't serve in the militia, we're going to fine you a lot of money. Instead, North Carolina said, okay, we won't fine you, but you will have to pay 3 times the normal level of taxation. Fine, we'll do that. And so they accepted that. They had, as a trade center, one of their biggest complications from the beginning was literally the paper money. North Carolina, as a crown colony, had issued paper money in the mid-18th century, as did most of the crown colonies. Well, when North Carolina declared its independence, the new government got rid of all of the old colonial currency and adopted new currency. And at the same time, the Continental Congress was issuing currency. People began arriving in Wachovia with this money. And the brethren were like, well, we don't want this stuff. We have no idea if this is any good. They said we're worried about it being counterfeit, and some of it was. But they were also worried that this was money, it wasn't backed by gold or silver or it was backed by the good faith of a government that might only last a week or two. And so, again, the elders in the church, the Vorsteher, and the elders decided, okay, we'll take this money if we have to, but we're going to spend it as fast as we can to get rid of it. There was also violence in the community, not just the colonial militiamen coming in, but the problem early in the war was you had both loyalists and patriots coming in. And even without the alcohol available at the tavern, this often led to conflict. And the brethren wanted nothing to, we're not involved in this. But they couldn't avoid having to deal with the violence that occasionally broke out. Ultimately, they managed to resolve, they did an incredible job of balancing all of these differing opinions amongst all of these different kinds of people and giving enough loyalty to the colonial government that they were able to escape trouble. Again, I forgot to mention, one of the objections they had to the loyalty oath was, again, unique to the brethren. The oath prescribed by the government of North Carolina not only meant you had to swear allegiance to the government of North Carolina or affirm your allegiance in the case of the brethren, you had to reject, explicitly reject any allegiance or loyalty to the King of England. And the brethren pointed out, look, we're part of a global church. Our members are called to mission service in the British Empire. We can't put them at risk of being considered traitors when they show up in a British colony somewhere. And so the state of North Carolina provided a modified oath for the brethren in which they affirmed they were loyal subjects of North Carolina and would do nothing to aid the enemies of North Carolina. And that was sufficient.
Perfect. So, in this broad panel of experts in talking about all sorts of people, from native groups to enslaved people to religious eccentrics and the various armies and militia groups coming through, we are talking about a lot of people today, and some of them people less represented, as we've already talked about. So Kathleen, the last of my questions before I open it up to the audience, my question for you is, why is this larger context even important for understanding the war for independence here in the American South?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe the first reason is just sort of, as we listen to these stories, they are fascinating and interesting. And that is one of the purposes of history, I think, is just to be interesting, right? And so they, by hearing different perspectives, I think it also sort of echoes more our experience today. Like, we know people today don't all agree on everything, right? We actually have some very, very serious disagreements with one another. And that was not less true in the past. In fact, at a time of revolution, it was even more true. There are a variety of opinions about revolution, from people who think it's treason, to people who think protest is fine, but war and independence are not, to people who are leading it from the beginning. And then there are many, many experiences of war, depending on where people lived and what their, whether they were men or women, or what their involvement with different parts of the war might have been. And then I'd say finally that by recognizing that there were many people who were, should we just say, not 100% behind violent revolution, it helps us realize how, it sort of helps us work against that idea that we might accidentally get that the revolution and the creation of the United States is inevitable. It wasn't. It was very difficult and at many points unlikely. And I think, if we sort of imagine, there are some founding fathers and they get this idea and they pretty easily win a war and create this great country, we kind of underestimate the real challenges that they faced and the really amazing story it is that this country came to be and has existed for 250 years and counting.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to all of my panelists. You all answered my questions eloquently, as I knew you would. But now I'm going to turn it out to my audience. Now, do not be intimidated. This is a rare opportunity to ask any question to a bunch of professional nerds. So, excellent. So I'm going to start over there, maroon shirt.
Yes, when the Virginia governor declared that he was going to free all of the slaves during the Revolutionary War, and I think it was the Virginia governor, did that have any sort of meaningful impact on the war at that time, and did it spill into North Carolina and affect the Wachovia region?
Maybe we could each take a
I
little
don't
piece of
know that
I'll
one.
start with, so Governor Dunmore in Virginia, and I think it's 1774, 75, declares not that all slaves are free, right, but that enslaved people who, he says, if you are enslaved by a master who's in rebellion against the crown, and you're a man of military age, and you can make it to British lines, you'll get your freedom. Now, lots and lots of people come who don't fit any of those categories, like people come bringing their children. They have no idea when somebody comes if the person who enslaved them was in rebellion or a loyalist, right? They, when they come, they arrive, they say, it's always a rebel that was enslaving them. And so, yeah, I think it certainly in parts, so I would say, then that last part of that a person has to make it to British lines affects who can seize that opportunity. And so early on, it's mostly people in Norfolk, Virginia, and places like that where Governor Dunmore actually is, like they can get to the British Army there. Later in the war, actually, the British make that policy for all fronts of the war, not just in Virginia. And so when Cornwallis marches through here, that's when some enslaved people in North Carolina, depending on how close they are to where Cornwallis is zigzagging around, take the opportunity to seize their freedom. And so thousands of men, women, and children, mostly children being carried and brought with their parents, make their way to Cornwallis's army. By the time Cornwallis gets up to Virginia, there are he has his army, but then he's got a camp of many, many hundreds, perhaps thousands of enslaved people who are the men are fighting or doing sort of physical labor along with the army. Women are also doing physical labor of laundry and other sorts of services along with it. So, I don't know if there's...
Yeah, Kathleen mentioned very nicely the long-term effect of not just Dunmore's proclamation, but the presence of the British Army as a means of liberation. In the short term, though, in answer to your question, Lord Dunmore, something like 1,000 black men did rally to Dunmore. He created what was called his Ethiopian Regiment, or what was named, we're not sure Dunmore actually used that term, but they were called the Ethiopian Regiment. It was a disaster. They fought one battle at Great Bridge against the Virginia militia, which didn't go well, but the vast majority of them died of disease in camps around Norfolk. They were crowded into a camp as Dunmore was preparing to, actually Dunmore evacuated Virginia at that time and basically abandoned the regiment. So the ones who initially responded to Dunmore did not go well. But during the course of the war, that example of the British offering a form of a route to liberation So that ultimately, when the British finally did leave New York in the end of the war, at least 3,000 formerly enslaved individuals, including one of Patrick Henry's slaves, one of George Washington's slaves, sailed out with the British from New York.
All right. Another question? Excellent.
Similar. Do we know, or why did the Moravians not free their slaves when they were admitted to the Brotherhood?
I do know some of that. Number one, they were not abolitionists.
Right.
The Moravians accepted the laws of the land where they went, and they came to the Caribbean for their first missions before they came to the British colonies in North America. They started out in the Caribbean. Now, they would occasionally, again, they would buy someone if it was possible for them to go through the conversion process and joining the church. And they would do that so they could have some sort of legal control over the enslaved person to keep them from being taken away by another owner. But they didn't have a wholesale policy of manumission. We do know that there were times when they tried to help enslaved people become free. So famously in the early 1800s, Peter Oliver, who's known from Salem, he is helped by the Brethren to become free, although he's using mostly his own money. And he had money because he was allowed to keep the money that he earned from selling his own pottery. And we know that Johann Samuel, there is a reference in the Bethabara diary, we want to free the Samuel family, but the laws of this state make it very difficult. So what North Carolina and Virginia were doing this as well, and I assume that other states in the South were doing this, they were putting up barriers to manumission. So you were restricted in whom you could free. And in order to free Johann Samuel's family, the Brethren of Bethabara actually had to go to the North Carolina legislature and have a law passed to make that happen. There were a lot of legal hoops to jump through, but eventually all of the children, he and his wife, are freed. And the last child is born free because he's born to two free parents.
Please.
Not only did they make it difficult to manumit, I believe North Carolina did this. Most southern states passed laws that if you were manumitted, you were required to leave the state within a year.
Yes, I know that Virginia did that,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah,
You
I
had
know
to
Virginia
leave.
did. I think
Yeah.
North Carolina did as well. And so that was always a deterrent to freedom. It's also, let me also add, not only were the Brethren not abolitionists, they, at least in the 18th century, what they said was, God has chosen for some reason to make some people slaves, and we must accept God's will. You're right, they were willing to free those that demonstrated they were members of the Brethren, but they did not challenge the legality or even the morality of slavery broadly.
I should also point out that the church integration and the spiritual equality and the social respect that enslaved and free African Americans had in this community, that was phased out in the 1800s. And by 1820s, you have a separate church completely. At first, black and white people within the church buildings had to sit separately. After having been once sitting next to each other and exchanging the kiss of peace. By the 1800s, they're sitting separately. By early 1820s, there is a physically separate congregation, and if any of you are local, you might know about the St. Philip's Church at the south end of Church Street. And that was built separately when the churches not only separated the buildings, but then the graveyards were also separated.
Excellent. Another question?
When they started doing like the separation and stuff, was that because of like the laws at the time, or was it that's just what the society decided to do?
So John Sensbach has this wonderful book about the African American Moravian community, and he talks about the changing attitudes. So the people who come here in the 1750s, 1760s, and 70s, many of them are Moravians from Europe. And their children and grandchildren are being raised here in North Carolina, and they gradually come to adopt the racial attitudes and segregation practices that they are growing up among. And so you see, there's a reference to Johann Samuel, who is actually put in charge of the farm. He's the superintendent of the Bethabara farm. But there is a son of a Moravian who grows up here who will not take orders from a black man. It is just seen as demeaning. And there is such an argument between the father and the son that it's actually written up in the Bethabara diary. I believe they almost come to blows about it. So you just have the cultural attitudes of people in this area changing. And by the time you get to the middle of the 1800s, you have, even before 1850, you have individual slave ownership. Legally, you could not have slaves within the town limits of Salem. So when Dr. Schumann wants to keep slaves when he comes to this community of Salem to be a doctor, he has to agree to live outside the boundaries of the town, and where he put his farm is what becomes Happy Hill neighborhood today. And the Schumann farm was a plantation in the traditional sense of enslaved people living and working a farm to make profit for their owners.
Yes, question in the back?
Yes. So hearing about all the slavery and segregation issues, it had me wondering about the tribes of the region. What were they having to deal with at the time?
I'm sorry, did you say the tribe? Oh, so now I know nothing about the Cherokee in the 1700s. The Moravians who came here, one of the reasons they came here, they did intend to build a mission to the Cherokees. However, between setting up the town and then the American Revolution, they get sidetracked. So it's not until the 1800s when I believe it's Abraham Steiner is sent to establish the mission. And the mission is eventually put at Spring Place, Georgia. And Steiner is also one of the early heads of the girls' school that becomes Salem Academy and College, which is why I know so much about him. But it's not until the 1800s that they really strongly start that mission. And the Cherokees say, we will let you build a church here if you build schools. And because the Cherokee students who go through the schools, it's basically like an elementary school. And then there are Cherokees who want further education, and the girls are sent to what is now Salem Academy and College. And so that's why I happen to know a lot about that from the 1800s, but I know nothing about the Cherokees during the 1700s, so I'll turn it over to others.
In the 18th century, the Brethren adopted the attitude of most of their neighbors, which is the Cherokee were the enemy. The Brethren arrived here in 1753. Almost immediately, the French and Indian War broke out, in which the Cherokee were active, and again, they built the palisade to protect themselves. They had their own separate militia unit. The Moravians had a distinct militia unit because, again, they were quite willing to engage in defensive warfare to protect themselves. Then during the American Revolution, for the Overmountain men of Tennessee, or what's now Tennessee, Kentucky, Southwest Virginia, as Kathleen was mentioning, there was a war between the Cherokee believed that the Anglo settlers, the English settlers, that was the threat to their land. The British king had tried to keep American settlers from getting into Cherokee territory. As early as 1763, they had drawn a line, the Proclamation of 1763, and told settlers, you can't go beyond that line, which they ignored. And so there had been a series of battles between English settlers and Cherokee throughout the 1760s, 1770s, into the 1780s that blended into the American Revolution. Only later, when the Revolution was over, when the Cherokee had accepted the fact that the Americans were here to stay, did you begin to get the peaceful relations that opened the way for the missionary activity.
I'll jump in and add a little bit to that too.
Yeah.
Because I think, we often think of the Cherokee as a single nation, a single tribe. But it is during the American Revolution that you see that start to fragment. You do have this element within the Cherokee Nation that moves down into Georgia on Chickamauga Creek and will continue hostility towards Americans until the death of their main leader, Dragon Canoe, in 1792. So 9 years after the Treaty of Paris, ending the American Revolution, which made no mention of Native people whatsoever. But I think after that, the large defeat by Patriot forces during the Cherokee War of 1776, you start to see the Cherokee approach neutrality towards the Americans, realizing that it's through treaty, not an arms contest, that they can potentially try to protect their rights, their land, their sovereignty. But then when you see the Americans win the revolution and the British leave, and you no longer have this other big kid on the block who can back your play, it really kind of forces the Cherokee into a corner, and they start to really look at, okay, cultural adaptation might be our next strategy for survival. So looking at the early 19th century, like Michelle was talking about, saying, yes, come build a church, but also build a school. They're like, okay, if we're going to adopt Anglo-style homes, farming, clothing, racial views, education, newspapers, we need to get whatever we can to try and better compete against the Americans instead of trying to wage war.
No, absolutely. The Cherokees wanted those schools so that they could be assimilated, if you will. They chose that as a means to survive and keep their sovereignty.
Right, I think that pair is really important because they wanted to keep their sovereignty. They still spoke Cherokee. They still they developed a syllabary to write the Cherokee language. So it wasn't they were completely converting to all these other ways. They were just adopting some of the sort of, I think, in some ways what they saw as kind of being a modern nation, but assuming they would continue to be the Cherokee nation in the place where they were.
Yes, they had their own newspaper. And many of the families who sent their girls to school here in Salem, the parents didn't necessarily convert, but the children might. And I don't know if you know that the Cherokee are matrilineal, so the women had a lot of social influence, and there are a few women who they don't convert, but they favor the mission, and they sort of like give their blessing to the mission in Spring Place. And to this day, if you're Cherokee and you live in Oklahoma, you will come back here. You will come back to North Carolina and Georgia to do family research. The Moravian archives list all the Cherokees who were ever baptized and all of their families and their sponsors. The same is true for African Americans. Your full name, your parents' names, your children's names, and the sponsors of all of your children at baptism will be recorded. So you can do good genealogical research here. And as part of the 250th for Salem, we had more than 30 direct descendants of Cherokee students came back. And the president of the Cherokee Nation came back to campus for a celebration of the 13 Cherokee students whose names we know who attended the school in the 1800s.
All right, we're going to open up for another question.
Less question and more context. In the 1750s, I think it was 56, 57, there was a group of Cherokee that came through here as allies, and they actually asked for missionaries. And the Moravians here sent a letter north to Spangenberg, and he told them absolutely not.
Yeah.
You are not here to do mission work. You are here to grow the economy. And in 1771, when the first history of Wachovia came out, they said, we are not a mission settlement.
Yeah.
We are a money-making settlement. In 1791, they rewrote it, and they said, we are a mission settlement. But there's actually several interactions into the 1760s where Cherokee are coming through, and the Moravian letters are really cool because it touches on that 19th century thing. The Cherokee don't want the religion. They are asking to learn English ways so they can compete against the colonial authorities in the legal realm. It's amazing. I have never seen another Native group that's looking at it from that angle. Like, okay, we're going to beat them legally.
Yes, it's a strategy. It's a deliberate strategy.
Yeah.
And I didn't know about that difference between 71 and 91. That's very interesting.
Oh, it's really neat to read that.
It leads to some interesting histories because over time you can see where people like older books written about like Bethabara or Salem will be like, it was a missionary settlement, and then later ones will be like, no, it was an economic settlement. And it changes over time, but Do any of y'all have any commentary for that anymore?
No, just I'm glad you mentioned that, because it was one of the most fascinating things I found in my research was, yes, this rewriting of the history of Wachovia.
Revisionism.
Revision. It's not new.
Exactly. Any more questions from the crowd? Yes.
What was the treatment like of the tribes that fought on the side of the Continental Army after the war?
Yeah, so most of them fought as individuals, actually. So they got the same kinds of pensions and such that other soldiers did if they were in the Continental Army, say. So really not much different. And in fact, in the years right after the Revolution, a couple decades right after the Revolution in North Carolina and many other states, if you were a Native man who was a veteran and at the beginning owned a little bit of property, later you didn't even need to do that, you could vote. So voting was not entirely racialized in North Carolina at the beginning. The same is true. There are free men of color who who own property who vote. It's the 19th century that makes that worse. That starts to decrease the civil rights of men of color, Native men. It's a little different with, say, the Catawbas. The Catawbas fought on the side of the United States in the Revolution, but fought in their own units rather than joining individually in militias or the Continental Army. And the men are away for a long time, and when they come back, there have been settlers who have come on to some of their land, and the women who were still there had sort of lost some of the land during the Revolution. Some of the women go with the men when they go up to Virginia to fight and such too. And so they end up with actually a smaller reservation than they'd had before the Revolution, even though they fight on the side of the Revolution.
And that was all. It was the same thing in New England. I mean, there were a number of what the Puritans had called the praying Indians. There were a number of native communities in New England that had assimilated quite a bit by the 1770s, and as individuals, many of them joined New England militia units. And again, were awarded pensions, were treated
They're there at
no
Bunker
better
Hill,
or worse
they're
than
at
other veterans.
Lexington and Concord.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's not veterans aren't all the pensions come very late for everybody, and the land grants are not great. Yeah, exactly. No. Right.
But they weren't treated any worse than the other veterans.
Exactly. Right.
All right. I think we have time for maybe one more question. All right, in the back.
When they came up from Kings Mountain and brought the prisoners,
Mm-hmm.
I know they were here for 19 days. Do we know the area that they were in relativity to today? Because, I mean, I know that they had to be around here, but growing up here, I'm just curious. Where was it at?
Great question.
Yes, we do. So when you have not only do you have these Kings Mountain veterans, these patriots, bringing these prisoners with them, you have these records, letters, notices that the patriots are sending out because they don't have a plan. They have, by the time they arrive here, 350 loyalist prisoners and nowhere to put them. So one of the first things they do once they start making their way towards Wachovia and arriving here in the 25th of October, they're going to start writing to what's left of the Continental Army, asking for guidance, asking, can we give these guys to you? Where do you want them? Can they go to Virginia? We know we can't just keep them here. So not only do we have those letters, but we have these amazing accounts from 3 loyalist officers who are prisoners who kept diaries and journals. So we have their descriptions. And then we have the town diaries, not just of Bethabara, but of Salem as well, because when Bethabara learns that day, hey, they're coming, they immediately send to Salem for help. And so you start hearing this conversation back and forth between the towns. This was requested, this was sent, this has happened, we're reacting. So when you combine all this information, they say there was they cleared, I'm trying to remember if it was the lower or upper meadow, but there was a large field that they cleared out and prepared it as a place for the army to stay. Now, this is only going to be where you have the local loyalist militia prisoners just kind of put into this fenced-off field, heavily guarded, and just left to lay out there, despite at one point they say there was a heavy frost, and they're just laying in the field. The other prisoners that they had captured who were of a different status, they were provincials. They were semi-uniformed, they were men from the northern colonies, they were actually in a regiment. Their leader actually gave his oath, gave his word for their good behavior, and they were lodged in different houses here in town, including some of the officers all kind of grouped together in family homes. And we have one account of their first or second night in town. One of the Patriot guards is so furious at the fact that he's out there guarding these guys in a field while the prisoner officer is sleeping in bed. He bursts into the bedroom, sword drawn, demanding that they give up their quarters, and the officers are terrified, and they have to go and send for a higher ranking Patriot officer to come and clear the guy out. So if you're a local loyalist militia prisoner, I think it was the Upper Meadow, perhaps, but that's where they're going to be kept, and they're finally going to receive word after about 19 days here at Bethabara that they are to march what's left of the prisoners over through Salem for a short break, and then eventually Salisbury. The Continental Army has ordered huts and a stockade built around the jail to house them there, but by that point there's just a couple dozen left. Once they are camped here for so long, if you are a local North Carolina loyalist, you're going to be recognized, identified, and extradited back to your home county for trial as a traitor, not as a prisoner of war. They're going to give these men the offer, well, if you come and join the Continental Army for service for a series of months or years, that will be your punishment. And once there's word starts to arrive, as they're staying here, lingering, one of the officers writes that at one day, I think it was like several dozen men took that offer, choosing their fate rather than dying by inches from starvation and cold. So they're going to sign up for Continental Army service, they're going to march off, and then they're going to run away and go right back to the march. So I think it was the Upper Meadow for the majority of loyalist militia, but the other single homes, family homes here in town.
All right.
Can I tell one more story?
Of course you can.
Just as a final note on the Brethren and independence. For those who are not familiar with the Moravian Church, you need to understand that every day they had a daily text that was distributed internationally. So every congregation would look at and think about and discuss the same biblical text every day. So that's a reference to that. August 6th, 1776, a passing militiaman posted in the tavern in Salem a copy of the Declaration of Independence. It's, as far as we know, the first record in the Moravian community of the actual declaration. This is what the diarist wrote, quote, "We sighed in our hearts, but the text for the day comforted us." Quote, "For a small moment have I forsaken thee, but with great miracles will I gather thee." So they weren't terribly impressed with the declaration, but they were optimistic.
What date was that?
August 6th, 1776.
Well, can I ask, when did they change from 1776 to 1783 when they had a celebration in Salem?
As they did with racial attitudes, the Brethren were very adept at following the attitude of their neighbors.
Yes.
By 1783, North Carolina was an independent state. There was no question that it was going to survive, and it was now up to the Brethren to get in good with the North Carolina government in order to retain their position. They were very clever politicians.
And they survived as a result.
They did.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. So Thank you so much to my lovely panelists. I know it takes a lot of time and blood and sweat and tears to gain all of this intellect and to share that with us. And thank you so much to all of you that are here. This is the reason why we do this. Thank you for coming out and supporting your local history site. Thank you for asking wonderful questions. And thank you for joining us for our very first live recording of Moravian Mornings. Historic Bethabara Park is both a National Historic District and a public city park. Park grounds are open year-round from dawn to dusk. Guided tours are available during visitor center open hours. Moravian Mornings is a production of Historic Bethabara Park. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, shoot the Moravian Mornings team an email at historicbethabarapark@gmail.com. For open hours, information about our events, programs, exhibits, and resources about the Moravians in North Carolina, visit our website at historicbethabarapark.org and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Come visit the birthplace of Winston-Salem in person at 2147 Bethabara Road, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 27106.